Can you tell us about your journeys to the Arctic and what state it's in?
Well, the Arctic climate is warming more rapidly than any other part of the world. It's about 3 or 4 times as fast as any other latitude. So everything that's happening in the Arctic is happening faster, and the changes that are affecting us, we're seeing in the Arctic first, and then we'll see them in the rest of the world later. So the Arctic is a very serious place because of the rapidity of change. And also all the changes that are happening have big impacts on the rest of the world. We've always thought about the Arctic as being an isolated region, and when the sea ice starts to disappear, the general view has been, oh, well, that's a phenomenon associated with global warming, but it's just another peculiar effect of global warming. But in fact, the retreat of the sea ice has impacts on every other part of the climate system, including sea level and methane in the atmosphere, many other effects which are more serious than the retreat of sea ice itself. So when we see the sea ice disappearing, which we're seeing, we should be much more concerned about all the other impacts that's having on the rest of the climate system of the whole planet, not of the Arctic alone.
Can you give some examples of impacts?
Well, the first one, I guess, that is the rate of warming is being increased by the fact that the ice is disappearing itself. It's called an albedo feedback. That is, when you replace very white substance, that is ice and snow, by open water, which is what happens as the ice retreats, then you're reducing the amount of radiation from the sun that's reflected straight back into space. You're reducing it from about 80% to 10%. It's a huge drop. And so that change in the Earth's average brightness means that the Earth is retaining much more heat, and that in itself accelerates the rate of global warming. Then another big effect is the acceleration of sea level rise. In the past, you always were able to estimate that sea level rise was due to two factors. One was warming of the ocean, so the ocean water gets less dense. But the other one was retreat of glaciers, so the glaciers in the Alps and the Rockies and so on would be retreating, and that was putting fresh water into the ocean, raising the height of the ocean. But what we've got now is that you still have the ocean warming, but a much bigger effect is that not the retreat of small glaciers in the Rockies, but the retreat of the Greenland ice sheet and the retreat of the Antarctic ice sheet. These are huge and massive amounts of ice contained there. Until the 1980s, there was no idea that they might be starting to melt because the Greenland ice sheet is 2 miles thick and it's always frozen. But then from the 1980s onwards, the surface of the ice sheet started to show signs of melt during the summer. And now it's got worse, so the whole ice sheet now melts during the summer, and all the meltwater goes straight into the ocean. Some of it percolates down through the ice sheet and speeds up the flow of glaciers. But either way, you're getting a lot of fresh water going into the ocean from Greenland, and that's now the biggest single source of sea level rise. So sea level rise is accelerating because of the loss of ice from the Greenland ice sheet, and that's associated with the loss of ice from the Arctic Ocean, because as the ice disappears from the Arctic Ocean, the climate warms up. So we're getting this huge sea level effect, which is not easy to reverse. We can't, or whatever measures we try to adopt to reduce warming of the air temperatures in the Arctic or in the world, we can't reduce the rate of loss of ice from Greenland so quickly. It's a very slow process. So we're going to see sea level rise accelerating steadily, and there's nothing much we can do about it, even if we can do something about global warming. So sea level is a big problem. And there's a few other effects, one of which is a real threat, I think, that there's a huge amount of methane gas contained in sediments underneath the Arctic continental shelves. That's where the shallow water around the Arctic. Those shelves are now ice-free in the summer. They used to be ice-covered. They warm up, and the layer that protects us from these methane outbreaks, which is a layer of permafrost, that layer is melting. So we're finding that the permafrost is going, and the methane that's contained in the sediments, it's in the form of compounds called methane hydrates. This just comes out, and each year we're seeing more and more big plumes of methane coming out of the seabed and coming into the atmosphere. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So we're getting an increasing methane impact on our climate, and the Russian scientists who are working there even suggest that there will be a huge impact from all of the permafrost melting at the same time, and then we'll have a huge pulse of methane, which will give us maybe 0.6 of a degree of warming throughout the world very suddenly within a year or two. So that would be a sort of catastrophically rapid rate of climate change. So these are all big effects that stem from sea ice retreat. And I suppose another one is the weather impact. We've had ghastly weather. Well, we have ghastly weather now, but we had ghastly weather last month, and it was the newspapers ascribed it to the beast from the east, which means blame the Russians for everything. But in fact, it was the fact that the jet stream, which is the westerly wind that separates the Arctic air masses from the tropical air masses, that has slowed down because as the Arctic warms up faster than the rest of the world, the temperature contrast between the Arctic and the tropics decreases, so the jet stream slows down. There's less force driving it, and as it slows down, it adopts the big north-south lobes, and those lobes just kind of sit there, and it means that within one of these lobes, cold air from the Arctic can get down to lower latitudes than it should do. So you find cold air in mid-latitude North American regions, and warm air from the tropics can get further north than it used to. So you can get very hot weather in the Canadian prairies. So we were sort of free of those effects, which were very powerful in the last 8 or 9 years in North America. But now they've hit Europe, and the same thing happened again, that cold air came down from the north, gave us these extraordinarily cold conditions, and at the same time warm air was funneled up to the Arctic, and the Arctic got to be 20 or 30 degrees warmer than it should be at this time of year. So that weather extreme effect is again another spin-off from the retreat of sea ice, and it's a very serious one because the latitudes at which it happens are the latitudes where we have most of our crop production. That's mid-latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's a very serious threat to overall global food production. So these are some of the things that are happening at the moment, and you can trace them all back to the retreat of sea ice. So the retreat of sea ice is not a harmless thing in itself. It has all these other impacts.
So what's the timescale and the consequences?
Well, the timescale, I mean, it's going on now. In the past, back in 1992 was the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and at that stage it was, we need to do these things to avoid catastrophic climate change, and it will happen within the next decades. But the feeling was, well, we don't have to do anything straight away, and so nothing was done. Of course, naturally, the default is don't do anything. And it reached the point where now we can't say if we don't do anything, something bad will happen in the next decades, because it's already happening now. We're already seeing unprecedented rate of warming. The level of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up faster than ever, despite everything that nations have promised about reducing CO2 emissions. We're finding huge changes in weather effects like hurricanes and forest fires, and we can't say that the effects of global warming are not hitting us yet, because they are, and it can only get worse because everything is changing exponentially. All of these really bad changes are exponential, and if you're standing on an exponential curve and you look behind at what's happened in the past, it's all nice and flat, nothing much has gone on. So you think, well, there hasn't been that much warming effect, so things might carry on this way and we don't have to worry. But then when you look forward, you've got a steep cliff, and this complacency in the face of exponential change is something that I think the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been guilty of, because the predictions that they make that really affect policymakers are predictions of sea level rise, and they've been really guilty in that respect in underestimating the rate of sea level rise, and also assuming that it will rise in a linear way. So whatever kind of effects they postulate, and they don't take a proper account of Greenland melt, but they show sea level rising linearly, which means that you really don't have to do that much about sea level rise. You don't have to worry for a while because it's rising linearly, but it's not. It's rising exponentially, as are many other changes, and that means that before very long we'll be seeing cities inundated, catastrophic flooding events in the coastlines of poor countries like Bangladesh. We'll be seeing sea level rise in itself, regardless of anything else, causing catastrophic change to our planet. So all these changes are going on now, and we can plot them, we can see them happening, and the fact that they're exponential means if we project those forward, we see really serious catastrophic effects in the next few years. Certainly in the next decade or two, the world will be completely different from the way it is now. But it's hard to get people to wake up to that, given that everything that's happened in the past has been fairly gentle. You're standing on an exponential curve and looking backwards instead of looking forwards.
So have governments been given the correct information, and why haven't they acted on it?
Well, I think governments have been given the correct information on the whole. Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the key is it's intergovernmental. If it were a truly international panel, then their results would be published in full and you would see what the threats are. But because it's an intergovernmental panel, it produces a scientific report. And I know this because I've been on this panel. You produce a scientific report which is the best that we understand about climate projection and climate effects at the moment. But then before it's actually published as an assessment, every government gets to have a look at it and make changes that they want to make. So you can imagine a report that's dealing with the problems of carbon dioxide emission causing global catastrophe. It's examined by a representative of the Saudi Arabian government whose entire income comes from oil. They're not going to say, oh, well, hey, that's very good stuff. That's very important. Let's make sure we stop using oil. They're going to say, oh, you must tone that down. You mustn't say anything nasty about oil. So the IPCC assessments are actually very anodyne, and that's actually a betrayal of the human race, because when it was set up, it was meant to be a warning system that would report on the best science about global change and tell us what the problems are and what's coming. But it stopped doing that job because it became a kind of tool of the of national governments. So it's not so much the scientists that want to keep facts from us. It's the governments of the world, because they would much rather not do anything, because it upsets their re-election plans. If you're a government and you have to be re-elected every 5 years, you don't want to initiate some enormously drastic program of change on design of cities, usage of cars, all of the sort of how do we do without the fossil fuel which we depend on for everything, and how do we switch into a renewable environment, and how do we try to deal with global warming drastically. That drastic thing is something that politicians hate because they want to get re-elected. They want everybody to think that everything's nice and improving and okay. So whatever they say they're going to do, they don't do it. And it's the politicians that are at fault. And that's because we're at fault. We're lazy ourselves, and we want everything to be just stay nice and not to be bothered. So we expect our politicians to keep everything nice and not bother us.
So how do you see a possible change to this situation?
Well, a change could, it depends on whether how optimistic I'm feeling about the human race. If we were an intelligent species, there would be understanding and acceptance of what's happening with climate change, what we're doing to the planet with carbon emissions, and then there'll be a really careful assessment of what is the best thing that we can do to save ourselves from really drastic change. And the conclusion would probably be, I hope, that not only do we have to reduce carbon emissions and switch to renewable energy, but we have to do much more than that. We have to find ways of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We're not going to save ourselves fast enough just by reducing carbon emissions. So all the ideas that have been had on taking CO2 out of the atmosphere by chemical means, or reducing the greenhouse effect by artificial engineering methods like putting aerosols into the atmosphere, all of that would be something that people would think about, and governments would think about, and governments would start to enact, because all of that costs a lot. And that's what I would hope would happen. But the first step has to be people have to be aware that this is going on, that if we don't take drastic action, we've had it as a planet. And these powerful actions need to be taken, which means they have to be taken by national governments paying out taxpayers' money to do it. So that's what I hope will come about through increased consciousness about climate change and what's going on. But I quite often despair that will ever happen. And in a way, it might only happen when the various catastrophes become so extreme in terms of hurricanes and warming and all of the bad things that are being brought about, that becomes so extreme that people can no longer ignore it. So I fear it might be that things get so terrible that they can't be ignored, and only then will we do anything.
So what kind of lifestyle choices could people make to influence the change that's needed?
Well, there's my feeling is for really dealing with global change, that is dealing with the problem of constantly rising CO2 levels and not being able to put a stopper on that. The only method is going to be some gigantic effort worldwide to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and that will cost a huge amount and can only be carried out by national governments or international governments. So we need a kind of Manhattan Project to do the research, and then we need to enact it with very large costs. So that means as individuals, the best thing we can do is to influence our elected representatives to kind of put in the effort and take this seriously and say that we have to do these things. So individuals working by ourselves, there was a a sadly cynical yet probably true statement by Sir David Mackay, who was the government's advisor on climate change, unfortunately died recently, saying if we all do a little, the result will be a little. And he was saying that what he really meant was if everybody kind of recycles plastic bags and so on, and they think they're doing a huge effort to save the world from climate change, they're actually doing something kind of negligible. The only thing I think that in which an individual choice could make a big difference is this question of food. This was brought home to me in a recent conference I went to, that if you look at the impact that food choice has on global warming, it's very significant. It's really the difference between eating meat and eating vegetable products is huge for global climate. And that's something where personal choice is the determining factor. If suddenly it became trendy to be vegetarian or vegan and everybody stopped eating meat, there will be an instant impact on global climate, because you would have fewer, much less animal husbandry, much less emissions of methane, much less space wasted on animals that could be spent on growing food for growing plant food, or even forestation of the world to increase reduce the carbon dioxide levels. So there's probably the only case I can think of where individual human choice would have a big effect would be food. In other respects, it's a case of persuading politicians to do the right thing, which is a very uphill task.
Do you think governments are hiding this information from people, and why?
Well, I think they are hiding things. I think that governments are hiding things from the public. And mainly it's this same factor that they would rather that the public was complacent and didn't really demand urgent action, because governments are not good at doing urgent action. And if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they've got a couple of black marks against them in the sense of concealing serious effects from the global public. And this is something that they're not set up to do. They're set up to warn the public about climate change and what's going on, and project what's going to happen. But the two big bad things that they've done recently, which I draw attention to in my book on Farewell to Ice, is that one is the methane emissions from the seabed. As the Arctic Ocean gets more ice-free in summer, the ice shrinks back, and so there's still ice in the centre of the Arctic Ocean where it's very deep water, but all around the edges where there's very shallow water, that's ice-free now, and that shallow water warms up during the summer because there isn't any ice there anymore, and that water therefore starts to melt the seabed, and that's where the seabed is the permafrost on the seabed is melting, methane is coming out, and the processes that go on really suggest very much that there'll be a massive increase in methane emission, and that could be a pulse so great that it would cause a very substantial climate change effect very quickly, because when methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, so it would just cause an instant impact. That's something which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mentioned in their assessments, but they really downplayed it. So you would if you read their assessment, you really wouldn't feel there was any threat from methane. But in fact, there's a very serious threat. I mean, it's probably at least a 50% chance that this huge emission will happen that will give us a huge jolt of warming very suddenly, something we couldn't cope with. So they've kept that from us by not including it properly in their assessments. And then the other thing they kept from people, although they've been forced to stop that now, has been reduced assessments of sea level rise. They know that there's resistance on the part of policymakers to doing anything about sea level rise because it costs a lot. If you're going to raise the heights of flood defences around Europe or raise the height of the Thames Barrier, it costs billions. And to spend billions is something that governments don't want to do unless there's a direct threat that's very obvious. And sea level rise is a direct threat, but they feel, the governments share the cowardice of the people. They feel that there isn't an immediate threat. We're not all going to get carried away by Noah's flood, so we don't have to do anything much at the moment. And in fact, this is exactly the time when we should be building up flood defences around Europe and especially in poor countries like in Bangladesh and China, where you've got a lot of people living near sea level who can't flee inland because there's no inland to flee to. So the IPCC has kept that in a way from us by making a very deliberate underestimate of sea level rise. In their previous assessment, they neglected the Greenland ice sheet completely. And then in the present assessment, they've included it, but they've included it in a way where they're predicting a steady increase in sea level rather than an exponential increase, which is what we're really getting. So you just sense that they're being dishonest and they're not telling the full truth because they don't, the governments involved don't want to have to do anything.
Can you tell us about the climate report commissioned by the Vatican that you were involved with?
Okay. Well, the Pope's has always been very concerned about climate change, and in 2014, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences had a meeting in the Vatican on climate change, which was called sort of One Planet, and we were concerned with. He invited a lot of high-level scientists involved with climate change, physical and biological and social scientists, to discuss what's happening and what we can do about it. And this led, via further discussions, to the Laudato Si, which is an encyclical. And Laudato Si was just saying that we are all stewards of the planet and we must be aware of our responsibility in taking care of it. And that was a very serious statement, certainly a first thing as far as the popes have been concerned. And it struck home because it struck right at the heart of those sort of people who deny climate change on spurious religious grounds. So it was very powerful. And it has led on to a further set of efforts by groups and foundations that are under the umbrella of Laudato Si, and I'm involved in one which is a Climate Restoration Foundation, where we're trying to find what's the best way to bring our climate back to the pre-industrial level by reducing carbon dioxide levels, and that means doing it by some kind of engineering method, so that's what we're working on at the moment.
So what's the timescale and is there an emergency?
I think there is a global emergency and the timescale is short, and that was really right. I wrote my book, which is called A Farewell to Ice, and it was to say, when I started writing the book, I'd spent my whole life working on sea ice and I was seeing it disappearing. So I thought this is really serious and important, and I'd write about it. But as I started to write about it, I was seeing that it wasn't just the sea ice disappearing that was the effect, that it was having an impact on all these other things, which was much more serious. The sea level rise and the weather extremes, methane, they were all effects that were much bigger, and they were worldwide in their impact. And when you look at all, that's just effects arising from sea ice, but there are effects arising from many other changes as well. And all of the impacts seem to intertwine, and they all seem to be positive. So the world is stuck with with positive feedbacks, which means acceleration of everything bad is happening. And that makes it very, very urgent that we start doing something, because at the moment we can just about imagine that nothing has changed too much. We look about us and we see the world more or less as it was in the past. It seems to be hotter summers and there's not so much ice, and we don't get snow anymore. But otherwise, we don't think that we're living on a different planet. But in a very few years, we are going to think we're living on a different planet because, for instance, the effects in the US, the floods, fires, the hurricanes, are all going to be recurring every year and getting worse and worse every year. So when you have a hurricane and then you clean up and rebuild the town that was destroyed, you'll be finding that town is destroyed again the next year. And so you'll get to regions of the planet where people won't be able to live anymore. So there'll be changes so big that they can't be ignored. And that's already starting to come about. So that urgency means we must be doing something now, because the trouble is, if you wait until the changes are extreme before doing anything, then you can't do anything because you're overwhelmed by change. You're firefighting when the fire has already taken hold, instead of putting it out before it becomes very serious. So we've got really a last opportunity, very much a last opportunity to put the fires out before they get to be serious. And if we don't take it, then we really get overwhelmed. And I think we're right at that last minute now.
Could you summarise the ice melting in one paragraph?
Well, the state of the Arctic now has changed. The Arctic is warming about 3 or 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. And that means that all the impacts we see are happening much faster there than anywhere else. So the disappearance of the ice and all the changes that are produced by that are happening very fast. And so we really have to focus on the Arctic if we're looking at what's going to be happening to the rest of the world.
Why is the Arctic changing so fast compared to other regions?
Well, it's various phenomena. Some arise from the warming itself. For instance, as the ice retreats and we reduce the albedo, that is, there's less white substance in high latitudes, and that causes more radiation to be absorbed, and that warms the Earth faster. But there's also an effect that's to doing with the thickness of the troposphere. The thickness of the lower layer of the atmosphere in the Arctic is less than in lower latitudes, and that's always been the case. So there's always been faster warming in the Arctic than in other parts of the planet, but it's just that when the whole planet is warming up, the Arctic is warming up very fast. When the planet wasn't warming up, it didn't notice.
And could you give us a snapshot of what has happened over the time period of your research?
When I started researching the Arctic, it was in 1970, and there was very, very thick ice in the Arctic. It could be average 5, 6, 7 meters thick, and most of the ice was many years old. Now, the ice average thickness is only about 1 to 2 meters, and nearly all the ice is less than 1 year old. It melts in the summer. That's a big change, a change in the whole landscape of the Arctic. And the fact that the ice retreats in summer means that now people are beginning to think psychologically that Asia and Europe and North America now form 2 different masses, land masses, whereas in the past, with ice being there all through the year, connecting Siberia and North America, it always felt that all the northern hemisphere is one great land mass and the southern hemisphere is where the sea is. But now we can see that the northern hemisphere is split and the Arctic is becoming a highway instead of something that joins together the 2 continents. So that's a psychological change, which hasn't, I suppose, hit most people yet. but those who go to the Arctic are aware that suddenly we're not looking at ice that fills the whole ocean anymore.
And how will this impact coastal cities around the world?
Well, the rate of sea level rise has been underestimated a lot but the present view is that it will be at least a metre by the end of the century. And a lot of the glaciologists who study Greenland and Antarctica, each time we do something, we do some measurement, we discover some new ghastly effect. So the fear now is that instead of being 1 metre, it might be 2 metres or more even by the end of the century. And that's a huge impact as far as coastal cities are concerned. I mean, it's because sea finds its own level, so the sea level rise will be the same throughout the world. And everywhere where there's a coastline, there needs to be a raising of the height of flood defences by 1 or 2 metres. And there's a big difference between 1 and 2 metres in terms of cost and possibility of doing something. So I think that's going to be a very, very serious impact, which we're not taking seriously because we would rather not spend the money.
Are there any figures on the consequences affecting populations around the world?
Oh, well, the fear with populations, for instance, Bangladesh has about 20 million people living within 6 feet of sea level. And as sea level rises, they would try to move back inland, but there isn't any inland to move to because behind those 20 million people, there's another 50 million people living a few feet more high above sea level. So you're dealing with very, very vulnerable people living right down at sea level, no money to build flood defences for such a sort of in and out coastline. And that means when you have a storm surge in the Bay of Bengal, which you have fairly frequently, but now you'll be having more of them, there'll be catastrophic floods, and that means hundreds of thousands of people killed. And there's been these sorts of floods in the past, and 100,000 dead, it usually makes a small paragraph on an inside page of the newspaper, but that's 100,000 people dead. And this will become more and more frequent, and the same applies to the east coast of China and everywhere. I mean, it's whether we are prepared to raise the heights of flood defences around East Anglia and London. And will the Netherlands do it? Of course they will, because they're keen on keeping their land. But America with Hurricane Katrina and with New Orleans and with Miami, those are cities which, unless very serious efforts are made, will have to be abandoned quite soon. Even Venice, where huge efforts been made to produce these protective gates, those will be overwhelmed by about 2050. So they won't last very long in terms of being effective. So sea level rise is very, very serious, and it's not something easily reversed. It's something that's pretty inexorable.
How does methane gas in the atmosphere affect global warming?
Well, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's each molecule is 23 times as powerful as a molecule of carbon dioxide in causing climate change. So methane is really nasty, but within about 10 years of release into the atmosphere, it's oxidized, and so it loses its power, whereas carbon dioxide stays in the system for hundreds of years, which is why it's such a frightening substance. You keep producing carbon dioxide, it stays there doing its nasty thing. So methane is really, it has a powerful short-term effect, and that's the fear for a methane pulse from the Arctic continental shelves. Will be a big pulse, will cause a very rapid warming. 0.6 of a degree has been calculated, but then it will go away but by the time it goes away, it's done something pretty awful for us.
Given that livestock are a major producer of methane, would switching from eating meat to eating plant-based provide relief to the timescale?
Yes, there's the various sources of methane can be mitigated to some extent. I mean, one source is gas pipelines, and the Russians have been notoriously careless with leaks from gas pipelines, but they could tighten up their care that they take over gas pipelines. Another one is this Arctic release, which the only way we can stop it, as far as I can see, is to try to bring back sea ice. And one of the methods of geoengineering that's been suggested is which is brightening clouds by putting water vapor into them. That could be targeted on increasing sea ice and therefore reducing methane emissions. But another big source is emissions from animal husbandry, and all of the animals that we keep, and with countries that are getting wealthier, like that never used to eat animal food but now do, like China, are having a huge impact on increasing the methane emissions. Well, China is the classic case, but there are other countries as well where when you get from a state of extreme poverty to a state of slightly greater affluence, people want to start eating meat. In the past, in China and Japan, where I've lived for a while, everybody would eat rice as the staple and a few scraps of meat, of fish if you're lucky. But to actually buy meat is something that was unheard of and unthinkable. But so therefore, the first thing that a Chinese worker wants to do when he's earning more money is to eat meat. Yes, well, I think China is the extreme case, but there's also India and the Middle East, Southeast Asia in general. There's been, in many countries, a very substantial increase in affluence. And that's produced a change where everybody's changed from a pure vegetarian diet, mainly rice, to being able to afford meat. And if they can afford meat, they want meat. And so there's this huge increase in meat consumption in the world, which not only requires a lot of extra land, which means it threatens global food production, but it also involves a lot of release of methane from the animals. And that is reckoned to be a fairly substantial contributor to global warming. And it is one area where human choice could make a difference. We say that we can make a difference by our choice of how we live, but most people don't particularly have that choice. For instance, if you live in Los Angeles, then you have huge distances between buildings. You have to drive. There's no public transport. Everybody has to drive everywhere. So you're living in a way which involves huge amounts of carbon dioxide emissions. You can't do without it because the infrastructure of Los Angeles is the way it is. The only way you can change it is to destroy the whole city and start again. But you can't do that. So changing your way of life is quite limited for most people's lives. They can't really change them easily. But making a change in the choice of food that you eat is easy. You can just choose to eat plant food, and that would have a big effect on global warming without having big changes in global infrastructure. So that's probably the only way I can think of that we can have a big positive impact by individual actions as opposed to communal actions.
In terms of a timeline, what date are we looking at after which it's too late to act?
Well, most people feel about 2050 is the date at which, if we haven't done anything, things will be so much worse in every department that we will feel the planet is seriously slipping away. because you look at all the exponential trends and extrapolate them, and by 2050 everything will be really bad. We won't, the world won't be anything like it is today, and so we've got to start implementing solutions and now, so that when we get to 2050, we're not simply seeing the results of extrapolating present change, in which case we've had it, but we're seeing something which is coming down a bit. Well, 2050 is within the lifetimes of many people, or most people perhaps, and it will be a time at which we will see society really collapsing if we haven't done a lot of serious things in the meantime. It's not when things will start getting bad, it's when things will really be bad, unless we started to really do something serious about carbon dioxide levels.